Okie dokie. Alright. Thank you to everyone that could join tonight on our Zoom review session. If for whatever reason you're having a hard time hearing me or the screen isn't showing, just let me know. This is a recorded session, so if you are joining us in today with the Zoom review, you don't have to worry. Your face or your voice will not be recorded in this process. Only I will be recorded, so you'll be just fine. After we go through this exam review, I will upload it to YouTube for anyone who would like to watch it that couldn't make it tonight, and use it as a study tool for the exam. So exam number 2 is going to be this Wednesday online. So Wednesday the 16th, you have any time between 8 a.m. and right before midnight to take and complete the exam, but it needs to be on Wednesday. Unless it's something serious, then send me an email, then we can discuss it further. But for this exam, we're just going to cover lectures 5 through 8. And 5 starting with the bud break lecture. Lecture 6 was fertilizers. Lecture 7 was our YouTube irrigation playlist. And then lecture 8 covers integrated pest management. So those will be the sections. We'll go through lectures 5, 6, and 8 together because those are presentations that I created. But I do want to say that the content that you'll be tested on for the YouTube irrigation playlist that we assigned, what I will do is right after recording this video and uploading it, I will write down like learning objectives from the YouTube playlist. So we'll just cover this really quickly. So this was the link to the YouTube playlist for you guys to watch for irrigation. You will only be tested on videos 1 through 7, not video 8, which is the UC Davis effective heat waves and irrigation. That you will not be tested on that video. So what I'll do is after this review session, I will jot out learning objectives and I will say which video it came from and also specifically what part of the video that topic was specifically talked about. So that way you guys can reference and know exactly what parts of the video to pay attention to. So I know it can be a lot of information, but I hope that can help you guys with your studying process. And I will also say that the exam is not weighted evenly. The irrigation section that you'll be tested on is going to be much smaller than the other presentations in the exam. So I will post the learning objectives and the times in the videos to look after, and it's only going to be referring to videos 1 through 7. So that's so you guys know. Cool. So we'll go ahead and I will just start with lecture 5. So we'll do lecture 5, 6, and 8 tonight together, and then I'll post this section 7, of course. So we'll just go ahead and get into it. Okay, so bud break and canopy management. I know I've probably said this 100 times, but a really good way to prepare for your exams will be to look back at the quizzes that you already took and study those. Also go back to the learning objectives and revisit them. I don't always quiz you on every single learning objective, but I did refer to the learning objectives and to your previous quizzes when writing this exam. So that will be a really good resource for you guys to be prepared. Cool. So we talk about canopy management. This is really like controlling the yield, the fruit quality, the ability for your vine to be infected by a disease. But also, this is something that we do to help facilitate other vineyard operations, right? So how we manage the canopy, shoot positioning, shoot thinning, hedging, leaf removal, cluster thinning. So basically the plants just grow and they're very thick and bushy, and we have to go in and we have to train these things and create space for air movement so that way it's a healthy plant. So you have to physically go in and make these spaces, right? So why is this important? Specifically for grapevines, light interception, right? It's going to help promote sugar accumulation and acid composition, bud development, fruit set, berry growth, and then also shading can negatively affect crop levels. So this is an important slide. I would definitely focus on this. A a lot of this presentation is just based on how managing the canopy affects the fruit. And so the ripening, disease pressures, mildew, etc. These are all going to be really important things to remember as you take your exam. As far as these other components like phenolic compounds in red grapes or reducing the level of methoxypyrazines, I'm not going to ask you to spell that, so don't worry. That's just a fancy word for vegetal characters. That is something that might potentially be like an extra credit question that I might give to you on the exam. So ultimately, we know that light helps to ripen the grapes. It helps to develop the colors in the skins and the flavors, and it helps to reduce the vegetal character that can come in wine. Cool. Yeah, and then also it will allow for a better application of sprays, right? So if you're going through your vineyard and your canopy's clean and your fruit is exposed, anytime that you do whether it's a nutrient or pesticide spray, it's going to be a lot more effective when your canopy's open than you're just spraying a wall of leaves, right? Cool. You guys did a really good job of this on your quiz, just telling the difference between like microclimate and macroclimate. Microclimate is just a smaller space that's affected by lots of things, right? Solar radiation, temperature, wind speed, humidity, and evaporation. A lot of this stuff may seem just really intuitive to some of you guys, and for some of you it might be just a little bit of memorization, but I feel like we're far enough along in the class you guys kind of know the system for quizzes and exams, and you guys have been responding to it really well, so you'll know how to prepare. Cool. Macroclimate versus microclimate, pretty straightforward. Macroclimate can refer to the Winkler Index, region 1 through 5, larger regions of areas. Then microclimate could be, people use it kind of loosely, like, right? So like microclimate could be El Dorado compared to all of the Sierra foothills, or microclimate could literally be block A in a vineyard of multiple blocks, right? So that can be a term that's kind of tossed around, but ultimately they're separate from each other. Cool. There are a couple questions about assessing canopy characteristics on the exam, so definitely make sure you know the difference between shoot density, leaf layer number, how leaf layer number is determined. I won't ask you to like flesh out specifically how to do it, so don't worry about like memorizing, multiple points of the canopy should be assessed, representative data, 50 to 100 points. So that's not necessarily important, but I want you guys to know how canopy density is determined and how it's a tool for viticulturists, right? Cool. You're not going to have to memorize any of this. This will be if none of these ideal numbers. That will be if you have a vineyard and you want to apply this technique, then you have that information, but I'm not going to ask you to memorize and then brain dump it later if you're not going to use it. Cool. And then I wouldn't worry too much about shoot length. Again, it depends on the variety that you have in the training system. So just knowing that it depends on those things is important, but I'm not going to ask you guys to memorize that. I do think it's important to know the symptoms of what vine vigor is. And so like lateral shoot development, so we have our regular shoot, right? And it alternates leaves and sometimes clusters and tendrils. But when you have a shoot growing off of that shoot, that's called the lateral shoot. So that is a really good indication of vine vigor. So there's so much nutrients and life in this plant that it's developing lateral shoots. That can be a way to determine how vigorous your vine is. So that could be a really good test question. So I'd put a star on that slide. And then techniques for vineyard canopy management. Just have these 3 things in your back pocket memorized: hedging, leaf pulling, cluster thinning, and dropping crop, right? Hedging is pretty straightforward. It's just going to help clean up the canopy, get you some space. Also makes it easier for workers in the vineyard to manage the vines. They don't have to like reach through like this gnarly bush of a plant. They can access everything they need to and work from there. So that's always really nice. Leaf removal. So this is something I hope we get to do as a class once it'll probably be near the end of our class because we're going to be approaching summer. But leaf pulling or leaf removal is very important. I would like you to memorize that 40 to 60% exposure of the clusters is ideal. That might or might not be a question. Cough, cough. So that's a good one to remember. 40 to 60% exposure of the clusters in the vine is what's the goal in leaf removal, right? Also, you guys did a really good question of answering this on the quiz, but knowing the difference between the sun side and the shade side of the vine and which side we remove the leaves from, make sure you understand that as well. Cool. And then, as we've talked about in previous quizzes, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. If it helps you at all, you just think about Japan, right? The land of the rising sun. It's like the whole thing with their flag. So they're the first country to see the sunrise every day because of their location on the earth, right? So it's the land of the rising sun. So the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And that's why we have some of, most beautiful sunsets on the west coast, right? So if that helps you remember, that can help you remember. That will be important. I'm not going to pull a fast one on you guys and be like, which side is the shade side in an east-west orientation vineyard. I'm not going to ask you guys to sit and draw that out and try to figure that out. The information's here if you need it, but I feel like that's just kind of like tricky memorization at that point. I think knowing the basics will be more important. Cool. Okay, and then cluster thinning, also known as dropping crop. So this is a way to help prevent mildew, right, in vines because you're opening up the canopy and creating space. But it's also really important to know that this is a tactic used to help ripen the clusters that are left behind. So grapevines, if they're really vigorous, like Zinfandel, we have a picture from Boger here. Zinfandel is a very vigorous vine. It'll just keep producing and producing. And sometimes when you leave too much fruit, or what we call overcropping, it can create very vegetal flavors in the fruit, and it'll have a hard time ripening. There's only so much sugar that vine can provide, and it just overloads itself with fruit. So we have to drop some crop to make sure that the fruit that's left behind can be ripened very nicely and then create high quality wine with lots of nice layers of complexity and flavor. So that could be a really nice short answer or even extra credit to those who watch this video. That could be a very tactical question that could be asked, but it's important to know what dropping crop is. It's also important to know the timing of when crop is dropped in the vineyard. So we don't drop crop after the grapes have ripened, right? There's no point to that. So you really want to drop crop right around veraison or before the grapes start turning purple. They start to develop color and soften their skins. Or you could say summertime is a good time to drop crop, right? Early summer, but definitely not fall, right? So definitely know the time that it is appropriate to drop crop. So cluster thinning is best done before veraison, so shoots and clusters do not compete for nutrients. So stick with that. Okay, so those were all really good examples of direct canopy management. Definitely understand the difference between direct and indirect canopy management, right? It might be one of those things where it's you might overthink it when you see it on the exam, but then you see it on the slides and you're like, oh yeah, no duh. So indirect things is things that we don't touch the vine for, right? So we're, in this case, dealing with the vineyard floor, fertilization, and irrigation techniques because those will directly relate to how vigorous the canopy of your grapevine is. So vineyard floor management, cover crops can help reduce vigor by competing for nutrients. That'd be one of the most important things to take away from this. Fertilization, right? The nutrients that are available will affect how vigorous your vine grows. I think it's also important to note and highlight the excessive use of nutrients and fertilizers can cause overgrowth of canopies and lower sugar content in fruit. So if you guys remember the first video in that irrigation playlist, how it talked about when a vine is very comfortable and given all the water and nutrients it needs, it goes towards like vegetal growth, so like canopy growth. But when things start to get a little bit, when things are pulled back a little bit, it'll start to go into like the reproductive phase, right? So it more focuses on ripening fruit and not creating vegetation, like growing out these shoots. So that could be a really good question about what are the effects of excessive nutrients and fertilizers, right, on the quality of the fruit. So you'd have lower sugar content because all those excess nutrients are going towards canopy, because the vine's just sitting in a buffet and it's just growing in its most comfortable state. So that could be a very good question. I would also like you guys to know macro fertilizers versus micro fertilizers. That could be a really good question. Just know, like, when you see macro, just be able to point out nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, or NPK, Mg, and then micro fertilizers would be everything else, right? So boron, iron, manganese, zinc, molybdenum. Cool. Irrigation. I'm not going to ask you guys these specific types of irrigation. I just need you to know that irrigation affects the canopy, right? And we'll get into that with the YouTube playlist as well. Cool. And then we have our learning objectives from our first presentation, which I referred to specifically when writing the questions for the exam. So definitely a good place to look. Okay, so that's our first presentation, lecture 5 on bud break. We're going to move into lecture 6. Unless anyone has any questions, feel free to stop me at any point. Okay, lecture 6, fertilizers in viticulture. This was a fun one. So fertilization is important, right? Because plants are stuck in place. They need nutrients to continue to grow, especially when we're talking about fruit, right? It takes a lot of energy to produce all the sugar created to make the lovely wine that we so enjoy. So that's why it's essential for vineyards, right? So it's going to enhance vine health, yield, grape quality, directly influencing the wine characteristics. So again, when we refer to that section of the exam where I want you to know the difference between macro and micronutrients, this is the slide that I'm pulling information off of. So being able to identify which of these are macronutrients and which of these are micronutrients, and then also understanding what these nutrients do. So this might be something that you need to make flashcards for, or sing yourself in the shower, whatever your method of learning and memorization is, but definitely put a star on this slide. This will be on the exam. Okay, soil testing. The big thing I want you guys to know for soil testing is what its downfall is. We've kind of emphasized this a lot in the presentation, I feel like, and in the class, where soil analysis is great and everyone should do it. Like, everyone should dig pits and know what the layers are, but the downfall of soil analysis is that it's not always a complete representation of the interactions between the plant and the soil. So just because your soil might have the perfect balance of nutrients, or it might have, certain things, doesn't mean that the vine is actually taking that up, right? So like you could have a good balance of cations, but maybe your pH is off, or maybe you have high salinity, so that way it's preventing things from being taken up in the vine, right? So the best thing to do is plant tissue analysis to find out what is actually in the plant. So I know I stress that a lot, but know the difference between soil and plant tissue analysis and when both are needed. Cool. For plant tissue analysis, just know that there's 2 different types of tissue analysis. There's petiole and leaf blade samples. We're not going to go too much into the differences, just be able to recognize that those exist. I think will be very helpful. We go more into petiole versus leaf blade in VIDI 303 in the fall, and if you'd like to know more, I'd be happy to share that information with you, but I don't think it's necessary for this class. Cool. I do think it's really important for you guys to know the difference between like organic, inorganic, and foliar fertilizers and when they are applied. So definitely put a star on this slide. Organic, of course, is organic fertilizers are focused more on the soil health and the biota of the soil altogether. That'd be a really good takeaway. And those would include compost, manure, and green manure. Inorganic fertilizers are fast acting and deliver precise nutrient control. So it's like a very literal dose that you put into either the soil or onto the canopy directly, and it's precise. And then foliar fertilizers are also just highly effective, right? So, and these are mostly micronutrient sprays. So zinc, boron, iron. These are things that are typically applied like before flowering to help with like flower set and then berry fertilization and development. Those are very important. So cool. And then here we have a picture of green manure for cover crop and then foliar sprays. I won't ask you to... How do I word this? I want you to have a general idea of what nutrients are the vineyards generally require during certain times of the year. So I think this table is very important. I would put a big star on this slide. I think the most important thing to know is that going back to what we talked about earlier about like excessive fertilizer use will create excessive canopy growth, and then your grapes will actually suffer. The big thing I want you to take away from this table is that we're not applying nitrogen during ripening and harvest. So late summer and fall, when the fruit is ripening, we are only going to apply nitrogen if absolutely necessary, because then it'll actually go to the canopy growth and not so much to the fruit, right? So just have a general idea of what nutrients are required depending on the season. And also, if it helps you just memorize the season or just know physically what's going on with the vine, it can help you memorize better. But that's the big takeaway I want you guys to remember from this table. Cool. And here we just kind of have an affirmation, right? Or just kind of reiterating that nitrogen, you don't want to apply it after fruit set necessarily. Potassium is very helpful during veraison for sugar accumulation, micronutrients during pre-bloom, and then post-harvest fertilization is very important so the vine can get ready for the next season before it goes dormant. So this might help you. I don't think I get into anything more intense than anything that's stated on the slide as far as nutrients and the stage that it's happening. So if just seeing it in this context helps you study better, then you can put a star on this slide. Yeah. I can guarantee that there won't be any tricky questions past anything that's typed on this slide. Okay. So not so much as far as what the questions will be according to this slide. I don't think you need to worry about this. It is important to talk about the environment and the impacts of over-fertilization. So I would say, understand what fish-friendly farming is, the risks of over-fertilization in a vineyard, and then also the symptoms of soil degradation, right? So I'd put a big star on the slide as well. So, and I'm not going to ask you anything from these articles on the slides. I just think it's important to know some of these local certifications that a lot of farms have and why we have these things. Cool. Okay. Cool. So that wraps up most of fertilization. There were a couple questions on your guys' quiz about like comparing France to Italy to Napa and the type of approaches they have for viticulture, fertilization practices, and just kind of their philosophy on winemaking. I would just keep that information in mind for the exam. So you just have it ready in your back pocket. Cool. And then we have our student learning objectives for that presentation. Cool. All right, I'll move over into lecture 8, our most recent lecture on integrated pest management. And unless anyone has any questions, feel free to step in. Okay, so IPM's a lot of fun. I'm actually kind of kicking myself I didn't take more time to talk about like owl boxes and fun things like that. So that can be something we chat about in class if you guys want to talk about it. But IPM is basically, it's a balanced scientific approach, right, to attacking a disease, pest, insect, or weed that's kind of taking over your vineyard and affecting your crop, basically, right, in a negative financial way. So the big thing to take away from IPM is that it is balanced, right? We're not trying to eradicate all things. Like, we're not going out there and just lighting stuff on fire or like setting off bombs. It's a very delicate and balanced way to manipulate the ecosystem in a way that benefits your vineyard and still promotes all the beneficial species that need to live in that area, right? So that is the big takeaway I want everyone to know from this presentation, right? And of course, it is important to know that every site has a very specific program. They could have different pests, different thresholds, different challenges, right? How we manage a vineyard in the Sierra foothills be very different than how they manage a vineyard in Napa, Mendocino, etc., right? Cool. So I do want you guys to kind of know these buzzwords like pesticide resistance, right? Do you feel comfortable like defining what pesticide resistance is? Knowing that there are beneficial organisms out there like pollinators, predatory insects, and then again, this is just more about why everyone should do IPM. Cool. There are 6 steps of IPM. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this. It's okay. I do want you to understand the like disease and pest triangle though. We'll talk more about this when we get into diseases for our next presentation. You only have an outbreak of a pest or disease if the 3 things come together: the host, the pathogen or pest, and a favorable environment for these things to thrive. So IPM, if I asked you a question about what part of this triangle are you affecting with IPM, it would be the environment, right? So you're altering the environment to make it more or less favorable for that pest to thrive. Cool. For monitoring, I'm trying to think how I would ask a question about this section. I could ask you like a very straightforward question about like, why is monitoring your pests important, right? Or like identifying, right? We don't want to prescribe a medication to something that medication is not intended for, right? In the kind of a layman's terms, right? So it's very important that you have correct identification so you avoid unnecessary treatments. Why? 1, you're wasting your time. 2, you're wasting your money. And 3, you could be harming something else in your vineyard that you don't need to be. Cool. So it's very important that we make accurate identifications, determine the abundance of pest populations, record and the stage of the crop and your management practices, and then also any and all vineyard observations during the process. So that could be a very good question there too. That could be a select all that apply, or I could say, what does successful monitoring in a vineyard include? And then I'd refer to these 4 different components. Cool. Visual observation is the first step in observation, right? So having a hand lens is important. I would probably sneak in a kind of a tricky question here. I could see myself asking if visual observation worked best for, and I could name something that flies. Or I could say a true or false visual observation is only effective for pests that generally do not fly. So that would be like correct, right? So anytime that you have something that flies, you want to use like that net that we talk about in a couple slides, but visual observation just for the things that are crawling at that time, because if things are flying, it's really hard to tell like the concentration of that pest when they're in motion, right? Scouting frequency, I feel like it's pretty straightforward. You guys have a good idea what to say for that. And then scouting patterns. I will definitely have questions about indicator plants for early pest detection, and just be ready for that. Indicator plants are very helpful. They're highly susceptible to a lot of things, and they will show those things before they are shown on the vines. The vines are a lot hardier than they are. So roses are a great example for that. Companion plants, I would like you to know how companion plants are beneficial to a vineyard. I don't think I'll ask you specifically which plants, but I could potentially see myself offering extra credit if you could name some and then also describe what their benefits are in the vineyard. I could see myself doing that. Cool. Pest sampling techniques. This is important. This will definitely be on the exam. Knowing when to use a beating tray versus a sweep net versus sticky or pheromone traps will be important. All the information that you will need should be on the slides for that. I'm not going to do anything too tricky. Just know that, sweeping nets are very helpful for things that are flying, right? Makes sense. The beating tray, not so much something that's flying, but all the creepy crawlies will fall into the tray, and then you can accurately, or to the best of your ability, count, right, the bugs and identify them, right? Also important to know that we're using a white background so we can properly identify the pests or the bugs, right? It's going to be very hard to see on a black background or anything else. So that could be a tricky little question there about the color of the beating tray. The pheromone traps and sticky traps are just a good way to monitor what's in your vineyard. I could see myself asking a question for how would you suggest monitoring, the good and bad insects in your vineyard. That could be a good question. Cool. This one's also important, knowing when pests will spread and proliferate. So phenology calendars, right? The cycle of the vine affects the bugs. It's all connected. Also the growing degree day models. Temperature affects phenology, right? It's not until it starts to get warmer and sunnier outside that plants will bloom, and then insects will come out, and all of our godforsaken mosquitoes are out again, unfortunately. So, temperature affects all of these things. So having both of these on hand will help to determine when you can expect these pests to come back, right? And then also the use of drones is very helpful as well. We're using drones more and more in vineyards, and it's very fun. Okay, for pest identification, I would like you to just generally know the difference between insects, pathogens, and weeds. For pathogens, I realize that some of the symptoms cross over with the symptoms of insects, right? So the big thing I want you to know for pathogens is that this part right here, lab identification is often required. It's very hard to tell on your own. So if you'd like to know some of the symptoms, but definitely have that lab identification part in your back pocket, that is the big takeaway I want you to know from pathogens for identifying that in your vineyard. For insects, we typically have chewing and stippling and tunneling. Tunneling is a really big giveaway. And so that could be something to realize as well, right? And then weeds, we just identify weeds just like we do any other plant or flower. And that's through the shape, the stem, and all the other morphological features, right? And then maybe just be able to identify general weeds in a vineyard. So started thistle, Johnson grass, crabgrass, horseweed, all very common weeds in vineyards. Cool. Establishing an action threshold. I think you guys are already pretty well versed on the subject, but we didn't involve any calculations or anything in this presentation, so I don't think I will be asking you anything about that. However, this pyramid is very important, and understanding the progression of responses in accordance to the situation in your vineyard is very important, right? So cultural practices versus a chemical application to your vineyard, right? Understanding the shift from prevention to intervention in a vineyard and how that varies completely on the circumstance, right? So again, balanced and scientific approach to pest pressures in your vineyard. Cool. And then there's just an example for you guys. For pests, I'm not gonna present any pictures and ask you to identify anything. This is just for your learning pleasure. And so you don't have to worry about being like me saying, "What's this?" and then you being like, "Oh, I forgot that was a mealybug." So you don't have to worry about that. I would like you to be able to give recommendations. I'd like you to be able to say UC IPM, University of California Integrated Pest Management Program, is a site that anyone can access. So being able to know that that site exists and recommend it to other people is huge. There are so many people who have like gardens and vineyards and crops, or even just, apple trees in their backyard, and they work a lot off of what their neighbors recommend them, but a lot of people don't realize that these resources exist. So being able to offer that up as knowledge will be very important. So UC IPM will be the big one. I won't ask you to memorize the rest of this though. Cool. And then we just have our conclusion and our learning objectives for integrated pest management. And then last but not least, I covered this a little bit at the beginning of this Zoom meeting, but I'll just say it one more time for anyone that joined a little bit later. For the viticulture irrigation section of the exam, you're only going to be tested on videos 1 through 7 in this playlist. And right after we finish the Zoom meeting, and as I'm uploading this recorded video to YouTube, I'm going to write out learning objectives and the time in which video it occurred. So you can go right to it and listen and learn, right? And also don't forget your journal for that is due on Wednesday as well. So I'm not going to have you guys sit here and watch through it with me. I will provide that for you tonight so you can start using it. And also this will be a much smaller portion of the exam than the other 3 lectures. So take some comfort in that. I don't want you to stress too much about it. So that's everything. Again, our exam number 2 will be on Wednesday. Covers lectures 5 through 8. You have between 8 a.m. and right before midnight to submit it. And it'll be the same format as before, just like our quizzes and our previous exam. So I am going to go ahead and stop recording as of now.